Thank you. So, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I don't have the presentation, so for the next 20 or so minutes, you will have to look at me, sadly. But I will, however, ask you later to use your imagination in a few scenarios. So, to give you a little bit of the context on the topic, and by the way, it is a great that I have my presentation after Eskos, because he's basically given you the background, at least in the criminal law, or the doctrine of criminal law, as in the continental part of Europe we like to call these sorts of ideas that I will try to focus on with respect to the broader normative and philosophical context that I would like to give to you. So, just to follow up on your presentation, I would like to suggest that the notion of reason responsiveness or rationality is a really good starting point for thinking about subjects of criminal law. I absolutely agree with that. However, I believe that there are some hard cases for this notion of reason responsiveness or the rationality in criminal law. Yesterday we heard a presentation about the responsibility of mentally disordered or mentally challenged subjects. I think that the case of substance abuse, and especially offenders who abuse certain substances, is the hard case for the criminal law. And therefore, I believe some more inquiry into the topic would be necessary. If you scope the literature, there are two basic models of treating the offenders with substance abuse. The first one, let's call it the moral model, will try to highlight that these subjects are rational. But it will do it for wrong reasons, I will argue. The other sort of paradigm will try to convince us that, as a matter of fact, the substance abuse is maybe not an illness, but a certain neurobiological condition that essentially renders the offenders, that's a rhyme, nice, renders them or sort of makes them only bystanders or observers of what is happening to them. I think this idea is also harmful when thinking about subjects in criminal law. I will try to argue for a middle ground idea endorsed mostly by Richard Holton and Kent Berridge. This will be the idea centered around the notion of self-control and self-guidance in the cases of substance abuse or individuals with substance abuse. So, in the first place, I would like to quickly sketch the most important premises of all of these three stances on the subject. I will try to highlight what are the problems that we are faced with, and then I will follow with three imaginary, or maybe not so imaginary, scenarios, which I believe would allow us to grasp what is the problem and what are the consequences of applying these three paradigmatic approaches to the problem. So let me start with the moral model. To say that a person with substance abuse is fully rational in the eyes of this paradigm is to say that the decision to use a drug, whether it's the first decision that results in addiction or whether it's every use of a drug, whether it's this decision, there are two variants of this model, I would say, but that's mostly irrelevant for the argument. The offender, or the person who becomes addicted, is responsible for this choice. This choice is seen as fully intentional and therefore blameworthy. If it is correct, then every offense committed out of addiction or because of addiction, because of the cravings connected with the addiction, is by proxy also culpable because of this first rational decision to use a drug. What are the problems with this conception? First of all, I don't believe that in many cases it is appropriate to call someone who falls into addiction as being fully responsible for it. I don't think it is this sort of explanation of addiction should be satisfactory to us. But what is more, to treat the decision as fully intentional and voluntary, and only then to value it as negative, it is a little bit weird, because look at this from this side. If we concede to the notion that the subject intentionally, voluntarily, taking all things into considerations in his judgment, decided to use a drug, we would in fact have to say that he was not a rational person in the first place. To portray this, everyone, or most of us, believe that using drugs is bad. We do have strong evidence that drug abuse leads to many problems. Not only behavioral, not only relational, not only financial. And still some people decide to use drugs. I think it's a really strong contradiction to say that someone would do it voluntarily. Or to assume that someone does it in this way. I would rather argue that the decision to use a drug would rather be an acratic decision. So the decision taken against one's better judgment. This model does not cover this problem, the problem of acratic decision, and whether this type of decision is actually a voluntary one. That's the first problem. Now, if we were to talk about the neurobiological model, this model suggests that addiction is a disease that stems from certain disruptions in the neurochemical or behavioral processes in our brains. The core assumption of this model is that the biological, neurological factors influence or actually force one into addiction. Of course, there is some strong evidence that the brain, that certain substances condition brain in certain ways, and that the use, especially over a long time, of certain substances can change the structure of our brain, can change our behavior. That's a fact. But if we concede to this way of thinking, we would also have to reach a conclusion that the claim that certain brain changes prevent individuals from being able to escape the grasp of an addiction, we would still have to say that they are not able to make a decision. And if they are incapable of making certain decisions about their life, about their actions, especially in cases in which they feel the urge to use a drug, I think it is a problematic notion, because it completely strips a person of ability to self-regulate, to self-control. So these two models, they result in problematic, I would say, conclusions for our system of criminal law, for our notion of agency in criminal law. It is either because they over-attribute rationality, in the case of the moral model, or because they strip the agent fully of his rationality in the case of neurobiological model. There is the third model, the one that can be reconstructed as follows. We do have to agree that in certain conditions, the neurological model can tell us a lot about the way that the offenders act in. But from this does not follow that we have to accept every conclusion that follows from it. Let's have an example to show what the idea of self-regulation, of self-control in this model is. Imagine a situation. I don't know whether any of you are a smoker, but you definitely know someone who smokes. As you know, no one is allowed to smoke inside an airplane. Smokers do fly from time to time. And yet, it is in their power to not smoke on an airplane and enjoy smoke after the flight. So the basic idea is that in this type of situations, certain amount or maybe certain type of power is within reach for most of people. Now it seems to me that in the cases of substance abuse, it is exactly this power that the offenders are lacking. Now, in what ways can this idea be used in criminal law? I would like you to think about three cases. For the sake of simplicity, let's have the scenario A, B, and C. In all of the cases, our offenders will commit a crime of theft. Now, in scenario A, this theft was committed because our perpetrator is addicted to a certain drug. He needs cash to buy another dose. In scenario number 2, our perpetrator suffers from nyctophobia, or the fear of the dark. Let's assume it's a severe case. Now, In the third scenario, our perpetrator is forced to commit a crime because someone is handing him at a gunpoint. If you don't do that, I will blah, blah, blah. Typical coercion. Now, what are the differences in these scenarios? I believe that some of them are really self-evident. In case of perpetrator A, the compulsion seems to be internal rather than external one. The actions of A and B were linked to some conditions specific to them, either medical or psychological. It's not important for the argument. While in the case of C, the influence was not specifically linked to the conditions of the perpetrators. It could have an influence on any member of society. And the third difference is that we tend to believe, or in the eyes of the moral model, we are inclined to believe that the perpetrator A, in some sense, bears responsibility for his addiction, while in the cases of B and C, they have merely found themselves in such circumstances in which they are prone to a certain type of stress. So, if we are to concede that there are these differences in these scenarios, then what they point out to is that we don't really have a good mechanism to differentiate the situations of all of them from the perspective of agency. Now, I would argue that this problem is a strictly theoretical one rather than practical. Because in practice, at least in Poland, there are certain mechanisms that judges do use to differentiate between these situations. But if we are to have a uniform notion of agency in criminal law, clearly model number A, the moral model, is not enough. The consequences stemming from the neurobiological model are too extensive. So what I believe is that the middle ground is what might allow us to think about rationality in criminal law in a way that makes it less troubled, I would say. So to briefly sum up the discussion, I think that the responsibility of individuals with substance use disorders still remains a complex issue. It is an issue that tells us a lot about agency in criminal law, and developing a more coherent characterization not only of certain disorders, but also supporting a uniform notion of agency in criminal law might in fact allow us to better perform the challenge of balancing the demands of social justice with the need to provide some empathy for these offenders with substance use disorders. Because in many cases, this struggle is something that is simply too difficult to overcome as a single person. Thank you.